to connect. Are we going live? We are live. We are out in the world and we are here. And for those of you who may have caught on to the fact that we are giving you a surprise live stream right now on 90s to Now, hello. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jerry Strauss. This is 90s to Now. And we figured, what the heck? Let's go live, bring some live entertainment to some people because somebody has to, right? Um, uh, yeah, it's been an odd week or so in the entertainment world, but we are going to continue to press on and bring you content about the past, present, and future TV shows and movies that you love. And we have the perfect guest for that this week. We've been talking about this all over our social media. We will continue to do so. This is the book. We're going to really talk all about this thing, break it down. And we have the mastermind behind it. She is an entertainment journalist extraordinaire. She is Thea Glassman. Hi, Thea.
Hi.
So excited to talk to you about this. I feel like I know you from just the words and the emotion pouring out of this book. Of course, the book Freaks, Gleeks, and Dawson's Creek. Um, and how can a book with that title be anything but a love letter to the television shows that you love so dearly? First of all, I have to ask you, this is kind of a broad question. What is your relationship like with TV? Like in general, from childhood, what role has that played in your life?
Um, I was obsessed. I, uh, my growing up, my parents really wanted us to read. They were not really like, or TV, I think, was not really a big part of like their world. So we had like a small black and white set that didn't
Mm.
really work super well. But if anything, that made me more motivated. I could watch Friends like if you like move the antenna a certain way.
Ah,
And so that was when I think I really fell in love with television and really fell in love with it was a step further than that where I would go every day after school. I would try to find where they filmed the exterior of the Friends building. Um, and like I finally found it years later, but I think that was a small hint of just how obsessed and like how much I kind of wanted to be inside the world of these shows.
yeah.
Um, and then it was Dawson's Creek, I think, where I really learned how much a TV show can like capture your heart and your mind and stay with you for years and years and years to come.
Yeah. That you were an absolute 90s kid. You were the quintessential, all of us who are watching, listening to, and being a part of this show, we're right there with you. Um, but that's really interesting because I feel like there's sort of this line when people grow up, some people just love TV. And for some of us, it's almost like it invades our emotional space. It becomes part of our personal life to the point where we start to care so much about those worlds versus the real one. And then we look back years later and we go, oh, that was probably a little bit problematic, maybe, but we're okay. We came through it okay. Did you feel at the time or now that you are kind of voluntarily or subconsciously shifting yourself into those fantasy worlds versus the real one?
Yeah, 100%. I felt like that was the power of just like slipping away. I think especially when you're a teen and when things are weird and complicated and you're insecure, and to slip away into this other world, especially something like Cape Side, which is just like drenched in wish fulfillment. Um, I was, again, a little bit of a weird thing. I became obsessed with Wilmington, North Carolina, where they filmed the show. Which is another sort of way of just sort of trying to disappear into this world that you've fallen in love with. I like to think I've hopefully gotten a little bit healthier with my obsession with TV, but only by like a small margin, I would say.
Would you has your passion for TV evolved with the times, or are you still kind of focused on the same TV shows that you were watching back then?
There are shows that I definitely like. I just watched Jury Duty recently, which was fantastic. I highly recommend.
Okay.
But there's a comfort, I think, in rewatching these shows and revisiting these worlds and these characters that I have like a steady stream of like 5 to 8 shows that I just kind of like have on in a
Yeah.
loop that just bring me joy and comfort.
That's what this show is all about. I mean, we all are chasing that comfort food. That's the shows that we grew up on or lived through or just continue to love. I'm going to read off the list here because there's 7 shows that are focused on in this book. And I thought it was a really interesting list at first. And then you read through the book and you realize sort of what the commonalities are. But you focused on Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, My So-Called Life, Dawson's Creek, Freaks and Geeks, The OC, Friday Night Lights, and Glee. And, you mentioned how important TV was to you during your teenage years, and you can see the way that you selected shows that really kind of spoke to that most awkward time of everybody's lives and did so in a way that, all these shows had unique points of view, but also very honest and realistic ones. Is that what you think stood out for you then and now as far as why they spoke to you?
Yeah, I mean, I especially think of Freaks and Geeks with that. I feel like Freaks and Geeks is just like the best example of that, and perhaps out of all of them is the best example of that, of taking these really small awkward moments and making you feel seen. Like, it's these things like, not being picked or maybe being picked third to second to last in gym class. You don't really see stuff like that on the screen, and it makes you feel so terrible. But then seeing it on a show like Freaks and Geeks, you feel a lot less alone. Like that show in particular was very good with the awkward, painful moments.
Especially especially when you think about the 90s and even TV from the 80s before it. I mean, when I think of TV in the 80s and depictions of school, I think of sort of the extremes of very special episodes where it's just like the worst possible things that can happen to a child or a teen. And the 90s, it was all about, to me, a lot of cartoonish caricatures of like the nerd who's like real, the screeches, or like the jocks. Like everyone was very exaggerated, but you really picked out some shows that showed some realness and some character depth, even to, the Freaks and the Geeks, and, all the characters depicted in Freaks and Geeks. Of course, quick plug, we have a lot of interviews with Freaks and Geeks alumni, so to speak, right here on 90s to Now. So make sure you go back to our channel, youtube.com/ at 90s to Now, and catch up on interviews with Sam Levine and a bunch of others for that show. I'm with you as far as just being totally in love with that series. Uh, a lot of these shows underappreciated that you chose, I'd say, especially during the time that they were in prime time, to the point that, some of them only did last one season. Does that add to the charm, do you think?
Yeah. Well, in a way, it's so, we always lament that we didn't get a second or third season or however many of My So-Called Life and Freaks and Geeks.
Mm.
But in a way, I do think it's, as you said, adds to the charm that we have this one sort of spectacular season. There's no discourse. There's no that awkward college years, because if they had kept going, they would have had to bring the characters to college. Like they got to, I think, avoid a lot of the pitfalls that teen TV shows had to deal with past season 1, which is like, oh no, we got the characters together. Now what? There's a lot of awkwardness that goes on past season 1 that they miraculously got to leave behind, which in case then just leaves us with one perfect season of television.
Yeah, absolutely. We can hear it in everything you say, just how much you have a passion for, these TV shows and all the thought that you put into them. I mean, you've been an entertainment journalist, so you've been working in this world professionally, but the idea of stepping aside to write an entire book and then put it out into the world is a big decision, a big undertaking. When did this idea first enter your mind, and what pushed it to reality?
Yeah. So it kind of all traces back to 2018. It was the 20-year anniversary of Dawson's Creek. And I was a freelancer at the time, and I pitched an article that went inside the writer's room of Dawson's Creek. And so I sold that piece, and I spent 2 to 3 weeks interviewing the writers of Dawson's Creek. And I didn't realize quite how specific and unique and wonderful and painful it was to work as a writer in a teen TV show setting. And it was fascinating. And it was also, I learned that so many huge writers got their start on this show. Tom Capanos, Greg Berlanti, Jenny Bix, who went on to become a prolific writer on Sex and the City. So I kind of realized like, oh, wow, these shows were training grounds, these like intense boot camps for writers who ended up becoming these incredible figures in the industry. And then I started to think about, okay, I thought about just doing a book on Dawson's. And then I thought about, I mean, there's so many other teen shows I loved. And I just wanted to kind of capture what it was like in this really specific time period, going through the growing pains, both on screen and behind the scenes. So I started working on a proposal and started pitching, and I sold it about like 2 years ago. So I've been working on it for the past year and a half, doing just tons and tons of research and so many interviews and getting to talk to all the different people who worked on these shows and kind of were part of these worlds.
Yeah. That's awesome. For those of you, again, this is a surprise live stream. So if any of you would like to chime in, we are live on Facebook Live. We are live on YouTube as well. Send us your comments, send us your questions, and we will definitely work them in. It's clear from reading this book, and you touched on it already, that as much as you are in love with the stories that had been told on the screen from all these TV shows, you're clearly also so interested and so fascinated, and you make it so interesting and fascinating to learn about everything that's going on with the real people behind these TV shows and what went into creating everything that we got to see. Is that, I mean, part of your journalistic instinct to find these real life stories as well, or is that more of a discovery through the research process that, hey, it's more interesting behind the camera, even more so than in front of the camera?
Yeah, so I learned really early on that was something. I'm going to butcher the name of the book, but when I was a kid, I got this book called, I think it's Frenchie's Scrapbook. It was written by Didi Khan, who played Frenchie on in Grease, and she put together this behind the scenes book on the making of Grease. And I can't tell you how many times I read this book. The idea that you could hear the stories of how they made this movie was like so out of this world for me. It's like a crumpled up book now somewhere on my childhood bookshelf, like dog-eared and like water soaked. And I think when I was doing freelance writing and entertainment journalism, I was really interested in, like, when it was The Office's 20-year anniversary, like, I would love to know how that production designer created Dunder Mifflin. Like, that was a story I was super interested in doing, like, which is maybe a little bit more of a different angle into a show. So I realized I was so interested in all the different facets. Or I did an interview with Allison Jones, who cast Freaks and Geeks and Veep and The Office. So I really realized I was very fascinated by the behind the scenes players and how they put all these shows together. Like, even like the cast is so fascinating, but I feel like there's a lot of unsung heroes that don't really get the space to talk about what they're contributing.
Yeah. Is there any, not to try to avoid actually spoiling anything you talk about in the book, but is there any kind of behind the scenes stories as far as a show coming together or its evolution that stood out for you that you had no idea about until diving into the research, that surprised you about what went on behind the scenes?
I was really interested to learn about how in tune the writers were with the fandoms. That part I did not realize, and how much they were tracking, and they were logging onto television without pity and reading it, and it would either make them really happy or it'd absolutely break their hearts. Like, I think we sort of mindlessly have these reactions and talk about these shows, but the fact that the writers were following along and they knew how, I don't know if you watched the OC, they knew how much everybody hated Oliver. They were very aware of all of these things. And that, like, it was painful for a lot of them. Like, a lot of them talked about how difficult it was to see when their episodes didn't land, and how hard it was to not start to write towards what the fans were telling them to do. So that was an element that I was really fascinated by.
That's really interesting because you think about how things were then pre-social media and how much more reactive things potentially could be now. I mean, I'd imagine there's, minute to minute while episodes are airing or streaming for the first time. I mean, there's got to be so much more of an ability to react and then change things on the fly now. Um,
Right. It's almost like quaint now when you think about IMDb message boards and television without pity. Like, oh, it's sort of like sweet in comparison.
it's like they're getting the notification via carrier pigeon or something like months down the
Exactly.
line. um, just going back to the selection of all these TV shows, because obviously there are other shows in that time period that targeted the same audience. I'm thinking of shows that were not included here, a 90210, a Say by the Bell, on and on and on. I'd have to imagine that these shows were selected by you because as we said before, they all bring something unique as far as perspective and realism to the table. Was it tough to come up with that list of 7? Did you have to whittle it down, or what was that process like?
It was really hard. I had 15,
Mm.
which was like, I think my agent was like, no. And I had to, and it was really, really hard. I tried to find shows that I could make the argument that they not only shaped teen TV, but shaped the world of TV in general.
Mhm.
And like Beverly Hills 90210, I feel like sometimes a little bit silly that I didn't include that one, but I also was interested to see how Beverly Hills 90210 created this mold of what teen TV could be, and that networks loved it. And then
Right.
all these took a jackhammer to it and started like doing super experimental things and like really experimenting with what they could do with television in general.
Mhm. That's awesome. That's yeah, I mean, I definitely see it that way as well. Like 90210 felt like almost the experiment, like the guinea pig, like the standard bearer, and then it's like, okay, let's blow it up and see how we can do things differently and
Yeah.
see what happens. And hey, the weird experiments are always more interesting,
Yeah,
especially when they turn out great. Um,
absolutely.
so g- we whittle it down to these 7. I'd like to go back down the list real quick, and if you could, whether it's a few words, go as long as you want, but just tell us what it is about that particular show that, from your point of view, made it book worthy. What made it stand out to you then, now, whenever, that makes it something that's important to discuss in 2023. We'll start with Fresh Prince.
Yeah. Well, like one of my favorite examples of how we know Fresh Prince is still alive and kicking to this day is the co-creator of the show, Susan Borowitz, told me that like not so long ago she was teaching a group of 6th graders just how to write TV, and every single one of them knew the theme song to Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
Mm-hmm.
And decades later, which says a lot about its staying power, Fresh Prince was so, I really wanted to look at a sitcom. Like it's my only sitcom in there. And it was really fascinating to learn about how this teen sitcom was made and the growing pains and the Will Smith of it all. Like this was like a lifeboat for him. He had gone totally bankrupt. He like owed the IRS so much money.
Yeah.
And so Fresh Prince, he had never acted before. Fresh Prince was his lifeboat. And that story was really interesting to me to tell. And that he kind of had this like shadow writing staff. So he had like a bunch of buddies off to the side, and they were writing a lot of the jokes too, which also created an interesting dichotomy with the writing staff and him. Yes, it was very interesting to learn how that particular sitcom was made.
Okay. One of the one-hit wonders, so to speak, season-wise, My So-Called Life.
Yeah. My So-Called Life was the first show about a young girl that like took young girls seriously and like took their problems seriously. She uh had to Winnie Holzman, who created the show, had to grapple with a network who didn't think people would be interested in a girl's story, and they didn't think that they could market to a young female audience, which is like so wild to think now.
Yeah.
But like here were these like, you know, here was this show that hyper realistically showed the pains and challenges of being a 13-year-old girl, which is like a very specific, difficult time for many people.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting to think about like a show like My So-Called Life. To my recollection, it airs on ABC. It gets the one season, and then it starts airing later on MTV, and it finds this whole new kind of second life of popularity, right? That kind of allowed a whole other group of people to see it for the first time and kind of send it on its way to, a show that gets canceled after one season essentially, and we're still talking about it today.
Yeah, one of the producers said to me, he's like, if it had not aired on MTV, we would not be sitting here having this conversation. Like he really owed a debt. He said he like owes a debt to MTV for re-airing it.
Absolutely. You mentioned it. I'd have to imagine if you're ranking these, this one is near the top for you. Dawson's Creek.
Yes, Dawson's Creek is. I feel like my parents were like, I can't believe she's still talking about Dawson's Creek. um, Dawson's Creek took teens so seriously. Like they took them so seriously, and the type of dialogue that Dawson's Creek that the actors were given, we had never seen anything like that before. Teens were allowed to be so smart, so witty, like you wanted to be them. It was a form of wish fulfillment, I think, that we were given in Dawson's Creek that I don't think we had really seen on teen TV before. And I think laid the groundwork for smart, sharp teens to come, like shows like The OC. I feel like the Dawson's Creek like laid the groundwork with that kind of dialogue. And of course, Joey and Pacey, like you can't go wrong with that.
Which team were you? Because I feel like that's the big defining line between Dawson's fans. Were you a Pacey guy, or were you a Pacey fan or a Dawson fan?
So I think like if I had to choose, I would say Pacey for sure. I loved when in the original finale they had Joey not end up with either of them and go off on her own to Paris. I loved that original finale, and then they wrote a second finale where she ends up with, spoiler alert, with Pacey. I kind of liked the idea. There was the writer who wrote that finale talked about how like he didn't really see it as that big of a victory for her to end up with one of her high school boyfriends. Like, let's get her out into the world. Were you team Pacey or team Dawson?
I watched it. I don't know the first time. I think I binged it over a summer, but it was years after the original airings of the show. So I was, probably a little bit older than the characters were at the time. So maybe a bit of a different perspective. But I mean, I'm definitely in that camp where I always found the Dawson character more often than not to be insufferable.
I know.
And I don't even know if there's a debate about that for certain aspects of his story and his character. And
there was this quote that one of the writers said where he talked about, he was like, we all want to be Pacey, but we're probably Dawson. And maybe that's why we all like don't like him, is because we see the most worst parts of ourselves in Dawson. Yeah.
Totally. My favorite on the list, you and I of course share this, Freaks and Geeks. Just and from my perspective, this is a show I didn't see until I think 2 years ago. And I binged it over the course of like 3 days, and just on a whim. I'd always heard of the show, never checked it out, but it's a show that absolutely, to me, goes beyond needing to be anywhere near that age to have to relate to it. Like, it's just a great show, regardless of where you are in your life. But what about Freaks and Geeks? You touched on it before, but what makes it part of the book?
I think it was its commitment to realism, which I think a lot of teen shows are not really given credit for. And this really pioneered this idea that we're not going to make this like glossy, beautifully packaged show. We're going to make it a little gritty. Like, we're going to lean into the awkwardness. And I think that was really the first show that did that, that weren't really going to give us as an audience that many victories. We might get like a little victory here and there, but like all in all, it's going to be like how crappy high school really is. It showed us, it like ripped off the rose colored glasses, and like nobody was having perfect kisses, or like, you know, their crushes didn't return the feelings, you know, it's like, it's real life. Yeah.
That's a, and you know, I never really thought about it this way before. I think one of the things the show did so well is, you know, the freaks, the geeks, it was all people who life was not super kind to
Mhm.
inherently, and they weren't necessarily that kind to each other or kind, you know, within their own groups. Like, it wasn't like, oh, there was no the jocks who had it all good and it was the homecoming king and queen. Like, it was just everybody, two groups of kids who were very different but also interconnected, but equally struggling. Like, in our own way, we all do at that time.
Right. And it like, it makes me think also what an interesting story and realistic story arc they did with Sam and Cindy, which was my favorite story arc, I think, where I don't think that felt so real, where like you fantasize about somebody, you think what they're going to be, and then you get together with them. It's like not quite what you had hoped for. And I thought they so beautifully laid out what that experience is like. And that was another very realistic portrayal of high school love gone wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. And, you know, we're lucky that all these shows bounce around different streaming services and, you know, never seem to go very long without being available somewhere pretty easily accessible. So that also speaks, I think, to the appeal that they continue to have. The OC. This is a show that I've personally seen very little of, but certainly has etched its place in pop culture. What brought that to the table?
You'll see, I mean, just on a personal front, I loved growing up. The OC did something really, really brilliant where it's, as Josh Schwartz called it, the Trojan horse. Josh Schwartz loved Freaks and Geeks. Stephanie Savage, who created the show with him, loved My So-Called Life. They knew both of those shows were canceled and
Mhm.
they couldn't make quite that show. But they thought, what if we take the trappings of Beverly Hills 90210, sell it to the network that way, and then shove in like everything we loved about My So-Called Life and Freaks and Geeks? Kind of like put like broccoli, like, or whatever, like chocolate, and then put broccoli inside, like what they wanted to do. And they really set a new template where they blended genres, I think, really brilliantly, and hadn't seen anything like that before. So I thought that was, I wanted to explore that.
Cool. Friday Night Lights, an adaptation of a movie that, you know, to my recollection, wasn't necessarily a top of the blockbuster charts success that called for more of that world, but translated to a show that, again, has transcended and stood the test of time. Why did it belong in the book?
Friday Night Lights, I think the behind the scenes process was possibly one of the more groundbreaking, just filmmaking wise. They took so many risks. They did not have rehearsals. They did not use marks. The actors were allowed to move around as they pleased, and the cameras would just follow them around. They used a third camera, which was, I don't know if that ever really happened, that would just kind of float around and capture like small tapping moment. Like if an actress was tapping her foot, it would zero in on that. The actors were encouraged to improvise, which also is like so rare in a network television show. So that was really, really fascinating to kind of explore that. And the cinematographer told me that from then on, every job interview, the person would say like, can we just like make it look like Friday Night Lights? Like that's what everybody from then on. So I think that says a lot about the resonance of the show. Yeah.
Absolutely. The final show on the list is probably the most divisive one as far as fans then, especially back then. Either you were with it or you weren't. We're talking about Glee. What was your experience at the time during the height of Glee mania, and how did it continue to grow on you over the years?
So I was for sure Gleek. I went to the concerts. I would say I wasn't a full blown Gleek, but I identified as such. Um, Glee, I was actually just talking about this with someone, was like, Glee, if Glee had come on 10 years earlier, I don't think it would have made it. I think people would have been like, what is this? But it came at the perfect time. And I really loved exploring this idea that this is a show that was the first of its kind. It melded comedy, drama, really crazy storylines that I think people are still a little bit divided about to this day. And this incredible choreography and music. So it was, I think, probably one of the most ambitious shows that had been on the air.
Yeah. Yeah, and unique as well, which is something that could be said for all of the 7 books that you chose. It makes this an amazing read because every single section is an entirely different experience that we're learning about, both in front of the camera and behind the scenes. And I'm curious from your perspective, and we're going to timestamp this a little bit because we mentioned it a little bit at the top of the show, but as we speak, we are in the middle of the beginnings, hopefully near the ends of Hollywood basically being shut down, a Hollywood strike. And another plug here for the channel. We recently did have an interview. We chatted with Gabrielle Carteris from 90210 just a couple of weeks ago. So go check that one out. But one of the things we spoke about was the impending, and then it was just the writer's strike, but how in times when entertainment output slows down, it's a prime opportunity for people to gravitate even more than they usually do towards that comfort food, towards their old favorites and the shows that they love. And obviously now it's easier than ever to stream, to go back and revisit those shows. Do you feel like, I mean, even just going through the beginnings of this time period where things may be starting to slow down as far as new stuff, have you felt that as far as feedback and love as people start to turn their attention back to the classics that you wrote about?
Yeah, it's fun because I went on various Reddits to bring up the book and hope that it would be of interest to people. And I was so amazed. These Reddits are live and kicking, and they're rewatching these shows, and they have opinions, and they're pissed at some characters. They're opening up discussions, and you'll see hundreds of comments. And I was amazed and really delighted to see how. And there was like one, my favorite scoop from the book, which ended up going on TV Line. I was so amazed by the amount of interaction that it got, which was that Katie Holmes had, according to 2 different people, it had originally been Dawson that the writers were going to have her end up with. And she went in and she said, reportedly went in and said, nope, it's got to be Pacey. And so I thought this was a fun scoop, but I didn't know like what the extent of the interest would be. And it was like, I've never, so many Team Pacey. So like the people still care so deeply about these characters and these shows.
Yeah. And it's so cool that we have somebody like you to bring all those feelings to light and to tell us all the stories of what went into those decisions, and just to bring these shows to reality in general. Because if it wasn't for the stuff you're talking about in the book, we might not have some of these shows. If just like you said, if My So-Called Life didn't make it on MTV, like there's so many delicate steps to take a TV show to reality, and then to take it to the point where it stands the test of time. And I think you've really you've really got your eye on exactly what it takes, and the types of TV shows that really truly did and have and continue to stand the test of time. It's got to be exciting for you to be able to feel the love from everyone who's like-minded and who agrees with you and feels that same passion about these TV shows.
Yeah, I love that teen TV fans are such a passionate group of people. Like it came into our lives. These shows came into our lives at such a specific time period. And there's some great quote from Michelle Williams that I'm going to butcher, but she talks about how when it comes in, when these type of shows come into your lives when you're young, you're sort of this open pore, like you have all these open pores, and it gets in there and it stays with you forever, which is how I now always think of teen shows.
That's
Or
awesome.
maybe, or not even then, because look, you discovered Freaks and Geeks 2 years ago, and yeah, and it got in there for you. Yeah.
Yeah, everything continues to as long as it's out there, it's going to continue to build new fans, and for shows, especially for stuff that really deserves it, right? Stuff that the kind of stuff that you in your heart want more and more people to watch, even now and in the future. Like, it's good, it'll make people happy and they'll be entertained by it. So it's great to see that people are still talking about this stuff. And it's great to see that we can read all about it. I'm going to show the book again because are we getting this good on the camera? No, we are. Okay. Freaks, Gleeks, Dawson's Creek, of course, Thea Glassman. And we are giving away a free copy of this book, by the way. Of course, if you are part of our Facebook group, checking in through there, please message me or just post. I'm not asking for much specific. What we want to know is what you are doing to help grow our show, and we are going to put all of y'all in a big random drawing. Everyone who's helping grow this thing called 90s to Now, and one of you is going to receive a free copy of this amazing book. So thank you to all of you. And Thea, thank you to you. It's been great to talk to you cover to cover about this thing. And I'm glad we didn't actually spoil much about it because people
Right.
are in for a wild ride reading this. So I'm excited for you,
Yeah,
all
thank
of
you so
you.
much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you guys for checking us out here on 90s to Now. Once again, we'll see you on the Flippity Flip. Thanks, guys.